today's COVID-19 and ABE updates webinar. We want to make sure that you download all the materials from the materials tab. We have quite a few materials for you today. Also want to give a thanks to Carla Vian from Literacy Action Network for providing any technical issue support. We are going to be posting or recording the webinar today, and we will be posting the webinar recording and materials to State ABE presentations at mnabe.org. So today is Wednesday, May 20th, and we have quite a few updates for you today with our COVID-19 and ABE update. With the Minnesota Department of Education, we also have staff from Literacy Action Network and our Minnesota Adult Basic Education Distance Learning team at Literacy Minnesota. My name, again, is Brad Hathkamp. I am the Adult Secondary Credential and Education Policy Specialist here at the Minnesota Department of Education. Todd, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Brad. Hello, everybody. This is Todd Wagner.
Hi, everyone. This is Astrid Leiden, the Professional Development Specialist.
Hello, everyone. This is Jody Versat. I am the Program Quality Specialist.
And this is Julie Danko. I'm the Transition Specialist.
Excellent. Thank you. And let's let our Literacy Action Network and our distance learning team members introduce themselves. Carla, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. I'm Carla Vian with Literacy Action Network. If you have any tech issues too, I'm helping out with that today, so just send me a chat. Thanks.
And Susan?
Yes, I'm here in my dual capacity as both a member of the distance learning team at Literacy Minnesota and also as president of Literacy Action Network.
Excellent. Thank you, Susan. Thanks, Carla. Thanks to our entire MDE team that's with us today. So let's get started. We want to make sure that you know how you can participate today. So when we get to Q&A sections, you can definitely type in your question using the webinar's chat function. And during the Q&A, you can also click to raise your hand, and we will unmute you, and then you could ask your question verbally during those periods. If you're having any tech issues, like Carla mentioned, just reach out to Carla, and she will help you out. We have quite a few topics for us today. We're going to provide some key messages and updates, and then we're going to dive into our summer programming guidance. Then we'll turn it over to Literacy Action Network for their updates, and the distance learning team has a couple updates as well. Then we have a couple things to discuss regarding high school equivalency testing and GEDs, then transition, and we'll end with resources and professional development before we go into questions and hear more from you. Also, just want to remind you that resources from this webinar and any of our earlier webinars can be found online at mnabe.org, and all of our presentations are at that link for State ABE presentations. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Todd Wagner and to discuss some of our key messages from the Minnesota Department of Education. Todd, do you want to kick off?
Thanks, Brad. First of all, I think we'd like to start like we have each of the updates. Brad, if you would go to the next slide. Thank you. Beautiful picture of the headwaters of the Mississippi at Itasca State Park there. And just wanted to start, as we have started these other webinars, by just acknowledging that it's been an amazing couple of months, incredible amount of change, and amazing rising to the occasion on the part of the entire ABE community. And just want to acknowledge that it's been hard. It's been a lot of work for us. We know it has been for you as well. And just want to encourage you, as we are trying to do as a team, to be patient with each other and work through all these changes together. I think it was Andy Albee chatted in at the very end of our very first update, which was probably like the week of the shutdown of schools. And Andy texted in something to the effect of, what an incredibly long year the last week had been. And boy, it sure feels even more like that after 2 months now. I can't imagine it's been just 2 months, but it's been quite a lift. Next slide, please, Brian. So I have just a handful of key messages that I'd like to share with you. Several of these topics we'll be looping back to, and other people will be presenting in more detail. But the first one that I wanted to start with, probably the biggest announcement that we've had in the last week, is that the commissioner has announced that the schools are now going into summer programming, going to be able to add hybrid programming to distance learning. And so the options will be to continue with pure distance learning, do some hybrid programming, or a combination of both. And Jody's going to address that issue in much more detail later in the presentation. The focus that we would like to encourage people to use, the lens that we'd like you to use when thinking about the opportunity presented by having the option of doing hybrid programming, is to really think first about how you can take advantage of that additional flexibility to reach out and serve folks who have either not been able to participate via distance learning, or for whom distance learning has been problematic. And it's certainly the way that we are viewing the hybrid opportunity. And again, Jody will talk in more detail about that later. Next slide, please, Brad. This is kind of a nuts and bolts piece, but one that we have been working on for a while, and we're getting close on this issue. As you may know, we have had an effort undergoing to sort of clean up our data in SID to make sure that we have classes that involve the integrated education and training model in career pathways correctly labeled. And we think we have reached the point where the set of classes in SID that are so labeled is accurate. And so the last step in this process is that for those of you who have a class that includes the IET component and is labeled in SID, you'll be receiving an email from Sherry Eichinger later this week, or maybe already today. I'm not sure. Sherry might have even had a chance to get it out today. That will have a form attached that you need to complete in order to give us information about that IET program. So please watch for that in your email and turn that around as quickly as possible. We would like to have everybody's form by end of business on June 12th. Next slide, please, Brad. Couple of good pieces of news I'm just going to mention quickly, because I think that Susan will talk about this first one in a little bit more detail later, but it does look like we are in position, the ABE system, to see a 3% increase in state ABE funding for the 2021 program year. We also have already received a preliminary estimate from the feds that would indicate that our federal funding for 2021 will be essentially level, maybe a little bit of an increase over last year. However, there has been legislation proposed at the federal level, which would also result in an increase to federal funding. But the status of that legislation, unlike the state legislation, which now looks pretty certain, but federal legislation is still in question. So we'll keep you posted as we learn more. Next slide, please, Brent. And then last, just a couple of nuts and bolts things from me. First is, remember, due date for grant applications is June 1st, and Jody's going to be talking about the grant application process following me. Just another reminder also that we will have both a Table A and a Table A1 for this past year. And it is on table A1 that you'll be reporting contact hours from the period March 14, 2019 to March 13, 2020. And those are the contact hours that we'll be using in the state and federal grant allocation formulas for the 2021 program year. Then that last bullet is regarding we are partnering with Literacy Action Network to convene a working group that will be charged with the task of making a recommendation both to LAN leadership and also to the staff here at the ABE staff at the Department of Education regarding the process for counting contact hours for the fiscal year 21-22. And if you're interested in serving on that working group, we do have an application out for folks. It was sent out in an email by Sherry Eichinger on May 15th. And we encourage folks who are interested to apply. Please note, however, that we are hoping to make that a fairly workable team in terms of size, and so we're shooting for 9 members, and we are hoping those 9 members will be as representative as possible of Minnesota and the ABE communities within Minnesota, program type, geographic location, staffing type, etc. And so we will be making decisions about the makeup of the group with attempting to make that group as representative as possible. So we encourage you to apply, and please realize that not everybody will be able to participate, but we certainly would welcome your interest. And with that, Brad, if we go to the next slide, I think it's on to Jody.
Great. Excuse me. Thank you, Todd. I wanted to follow up, follow up with what Todd mentioned about the annual grant application. That is coming due on June 1st, as I know you are aware. So kind of one last reminder to be working on that. I believe some of you have already turned that in, so that's great. I definitely want to encourage you that if you are not in the final stages of that, please be working towards that. Now is the time to connect with your authorized signer to make certain that that person knows what they need to do within SERVS. And just a note that there is some support available to you in filling out the annual application and the tables. On our mnabe.org website, there's a series of short kind of tutorial videos that can help you with those tables. And then we did do a grant application workshop a couple of weeks ago via webinar, and the recording of that is also on our webpage. So just a final push to get that annual grant application submitted. And if you go on to the next slide, Brad, just one note about that. We have heard a little bit of, or a couple instances of troubles with EDIAM. Remember, this is a new wrinkle this year for anyone who has access to SERVS. You now have to access SERVS through this extra layer of security, which is EDIAM. If you are having troubles with EDIAM, the most efficient way to get support and help is at this link that you can see on the bottom left of this slide. So when you're actually trying to log into EDIAM, there's a help link there. So please do use that if you need any help with EDIAM. Next, I just want to give a reminder that the 5-year narrative deadline has been extended to August 1st. I know those of you who are in the 2020 narrative cohort are busily working on your narratives, and we'll have those done by August 1st. I just want to put out this reminder again that this is not only relevant to the 2020 narrative writers, but it is also relevant to those of you who are required to write a narrative for 2021. And that group of consortia, there are 8 consortia, that is listed here on this slide. I do need to connect with all of you to figure out how we are going to approach the narrative review, which will now happen virtually online in August instead of in person in June. I sent out a survey to gather some information from you about that. Some of you have responded. Thank you very much for doing that. Others of you have not. So if your consortium is on this list right here and you have not responded to the survey that I sent out in email on May 8th, please do so when you can. I really appreciate that. Then moving on, we wanted to just acknowledge that there is a lot of information coming, at you, at us, at all of us. And we wanted to take a second to just list out all of the statements, the communications that have come directly from our office out to the Minnesota ABE field since the start of the COVID-19 and related closures. So there's a list of all of those documents on this slide. You can find all of those at our website, www.mnabe.org. We do encourage you to be familiar with what those statements say, because often the guidance and the statements that apply statewide or to the K-12 system leave out some of the detail that's relevant to ABE. So we have tried to add in another layer of detail regarding ABE in these statements. We will be spending a chunk of time today talking about the one on the top, the one about summer programming. And I do just want to call out or say a little bit more about a couple other of these that are new since the last time that we convened a webinar like this. So if you go on to the next slide, Brad. One is a statement that we put out on May 14th. And this statement is basically to confirm that remote NRS testing for including CASAs and TABE and Best Plus is an allowable option for Minnesota ABE programs. So we encourage you to be thinking about exploring those remote testing options. You can read that statement for more information about that. The other relatively new statement is about volunteer training. This one we put out on May 18th. And this addresses the fact that we are now allowing contact hours to be recorded and generated when a volunteer is working remotely with a student. If that volunteer was previously serving as a classroom assistant, and if they're getting curriculum and lesson planning guidance from the state, or sorry, not from the state, from a teacher, then even if they don't have the 12-hour training requirement, you can for now record and count those contact hours. So that is the main substance of that statement, and those are the newest ones. We are also working on updating our FAQ document. So far, we have released 2 different versions of the FAQ since all of this began a couple of months ago. And we have a 3rd version underway that has quite a lot of additional questions and updates. We're holding on to that until after today's webinar because we're anticipating that you all might bring up some really great questions that we haven't thought of yet. So we'll try to add those into the FAQ. And once we've had a chance to do that, we will release that out to everybody. And so I also just want to point out that those statement documents and this FAQ, part of the purpose of those documents is to give you tools to use with your districts, with your organizations, with others, that you collaborate with, to help them know and understand what sort of parameters and guidelines you are working with as an adult basic education program. So with that, I will pass it back to Brad.
Thank you, Jody. So the most important, or one of the big chunks that we want to dive into today, is that guidance on summer programming. And as we go through this, there are several materials that we want to make sure that you are referencing for today's discussion on the summer programming guidance. First off, we have the Governor's Executive Order 20-57. We also have attached guidance for social distancing in youth and student programs, which was by the Minnesota Department of Health. You may want to note that this guidance is different than that GED testing guidance that we had for GED testing centers from the Minnesota Department of Health. Third is the Minnesota Summer Programming Guidance for Schools. That was something that was published on May 15th and distributed by our Education Commissioner for a lot of our K-12 schools. And we also then have our office's statement regarding ABE programming for summer 2020. So those are the 5 major materials, the 5th one being our slides for today. Those are the 5 major materials that will help us kind of break down our statement and a little bit of guidance for you as you go into this summer. So let's start with a little bit of background. How did we evolve to our statement? And so the first piece of guidance that we had was the Governor's Executive Order 20-57. And there were a couple aspects here that we borrowed from or that we used the references from, including note to stay safe, distance or hybrid options, time frame, and additional guidance. So let's talk through some of that. So first off, the governor's guidance in his executive order noted that he wants Minnesotans to stay safe. So if anyone is in an at-risk category, that they should feel free to stay home and that they should continue to adhere to guidance from the Minnesota Department of Health and from their local physicians. And that guidance can be found at health.state.mn.us. You can see the link here. In addition, the executive order discussed that there are 2 major options for schools this summer, either a distance learning model or a hybrid model that embeds or includes both distance learning and in-school learning. Third, the governor's order talks about planning days, ensuring that staff have at least 2 planning days before the summer learning period. And so our interpretation for this for ABE is that we understand that ABE instruction is not necessarily in semesters or trimesters or quarters in the same set dates and terms like a school year in K-12. And since ABE is often ongoing with instruction, we understand and agree that we want to make sure that you, your staff, your programs and sites have the appropriate amount of planning time, but we also acknowledge you may need to, or you may also be able to serve students during that time because maybe your planning would be a little bit more ongoing, or maybe your planning has already happened in some cases. So we understand that that might be the case for your ABE program as well. We also, the governor's executive order talks about ensuring that the Department of Health and the Department of Education provide additional guidance. So let's dive into the second piece of guidance, and that is the guidance from the Education Commissioner. And in this Minnesota Summer Programming Guidance for Schools that you have attached as well, you can see that with that guidance for K-12, it talks about hybrid programming details and the summer programming timeline. It also does have a couple pieces of ABE-specific guidance on page 15. The ABE-specific guidance includes 2 items. One, just that it states that Adult Basic Education Consortia are providing programming via distance learning, which may continue this summer, or transition to hybrid programming, or both, a combination of distance learning and hybrid programming in a specific consortium. It also recognizes the May 6th GED testing permission that Commissioner Ricker opened up at that point. Note that this is in the use of school facility section in the Minnesota Distance Teaching and Learning Implementation Guidance. So that is a different piece of Minnesota Department of Education guidance if you want to see the permission for GED testing specifically. And both the governor's executive order and the Minnesota Department of Education guidance say that schools and the education programs must be adhering to public health guidelines from the Minnesota Department of Health and the CDC. So now let's dive into some of the Minnesota Department of Health guidance. For those of you that are working with GED testing centers, like I noted before, this guidance is not the same guidance as they gave for GED testing. This guidance is more K-12 focused and really talks about social distancing with youth and student programs. And you'll see it has quite a variety of different sections here, including more about social distancing, promoting cloth-based coverings, minimizing interactions between groups, and various other elements. The key pieces of a couple of key pieces of guidance from the Minnesota Department of Health document include ensuring that with your ABE program, maintaining the 6 feet of distance between all people at all times, maintaining no more than a 1:9 staff to student ratio, and potentially a smaller ratio in spaces that don't allow for 6 feet of space between 10 people. In addition, the Minnesota Department of Health guidance calls to minimize the use of community supplies, such as shared pencils, pens, and other writing utensils. It also calls for cleaning high-touch surfaces and promoting the use of masks. So now I'm going to turn it over to, that's all the background to how we developed our statement. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jody to actually dive into the statement itself. Jody.
Thanks, Brad. So we want to take some time to talk through this statement. Again, remember, or if you just joined us, the statement itself is one of the materials in the materials section of this webinar. We do encourage you to read the whole thing carefully, but we'll kind of talk through key points right now. So it has several sections, sections about summer programming options, safety considerations when thinking about hybrid programming, a little bit about thinking about at-risk individuals, and then some equity questions and the equity lens that we'll talk more about, and then lastly, it touches on the issue of testing. So we created this statement as Brad kind of laid out for you. We created this statement based on the framework and the background provided by the governor's executive order, the guidance from the Commissioner of Education for K-12 programming for the summer, as well as the guidance from the Department of Health about safely providing hybrid programming. Our understanding is that one of the reasons that the governor and the commissioner have decided to allow hybrid programming in K-12 settings this summer is in recognition of the fact that some students in this context of distance learning, some students are being left out and some students are being left behind. And that the intention of this approach to summer programming is to be able to bring those students back in or to better serve those students. So that is also the framework that we are using for our guidance to you, and it is a framework that we encourage you to use as you are making decisions about your summer programming. So on the next slide, this is kind of the meat of our statement. This is the change. This is the new information, right? This is that ABE providers at the end of this school year, and we know some of you don't have a quote unquote school year, so no sooner than June 1st, you have three options. You can continue to do distance-only education as you are doing it now. That is a valid and viable option, and you may choose to do that. You can begin providing hybrid education that combines some component of in-person programming together with distance education, or you can use both. And in fact, we think that in many ABE consortia across the state, we hope that you will consider this both and kind of a situation where you might have some sites or some groups of students or some classes that need something different than other sites or students or classes. So we encourage you to think about when and how distance-only education might continue and when and how you might add in hybrid education in addition. Please note that there is not an option on this slide or in any of this guidance to just go back to in-person programming the way you did it before. This is not a return to our old normal. This is a new element of our new normal. So in all scenarios, you should continue to provide distance education for your ABE students. And please remember that the main goal of adding in this hybrid option in addition to distance education is to make sure that you can provide ABE services in a more equitable way, or to work towards providing ABE services in a more equitable way, while also balancing public health and following protocols that will limit the spread of COVID-19. So on the next slide, we wanted to kind of call out if you are considering or planning to do some aspect of hybrid programming that includes an in-person component, you definitely need to pay serious attention and consideration to safety guidelines as they are outlined in the MDH guidance. We have kind of pulled out here what we think from a common sense perspective are likely to be some of the main factors that you will have to work through in terms of your physical programming space. But this is not an exhaustive list, and we definitely encourage you to be meaningful about how you think about and work through that guidance from the Department of Health. We recognize when you read that guidance, maybe you have already, it does seem fairly clear that it was created with children and youth in mind. Some of it doesn't really make sense, frankly, for an ABE context. So we encourage you to consider it a starting point and know that you will have to think about some additional factors when applying this to your adult basic education context. The next aspect of our statement is thinking about at-risk individuals, and we just want to reiterate the statement from the governor's executive order that none of this means that any Minnesotans who are in an at-risk or higher risk category should do anything that's against public health recommendations or against the advice of their doctor. So please be keeping that in mind in terms of your ABE students. Remember, you likely have students who are in high-risk categories or live in a household with someone in a high-risk category, and those students may choose and should choose not to access in-person programming. You also need to keep this in mind. ABE providers, our ABE system as a whole, needs to keep this in mind as it relates to staff. And if there is consideration of in-person programming, there should also be careful consideration of which staff are asked or required to report to the building in person, and individual staff health considerations should, of course, be taken into account when making those decisions. The next important key point of this statement is that we are asking you, as Todd mentioned, to use an equity lens when you are thinking about and considering whether, if, and how you might be offering some component of in-person programming this summer. Remember that the intention is to reach folks who want and need and deserve ABE services, but have had difficulty accessing those services at a distance, or have had barriers to accessing those services. So these are some questions that we hope can be the start of your consideration and your deliberation when thinking about how and for what students to possibly offer some in-person programming or in-person activities. And just keep in mind, the main goal of hybrid programming is to deliver ABE services in a more equitable way, but also while still balancing public health guidelines and working together to limit the spread of COVID-19. And then one more aspect that we address in this statement is about testing. We do not recommend that you reopen your ABE buildings for the sole purpose of NRS testing. Remember, the goal of hybrid programming this summer is to offer more equitable access to ABE services to the folks in your communities that need them, but are having trouble accessing through the distance-only model. So we don't believe that just offering people the opportunity to CASAS test or TABE test in person is really increasing equitable access to your programming. Remember, students can continue to accrue hours, and those can be recorded in SID even if they have not been pre-tested. That's what that COVID EFL exemption in SID allows you to do, and that will remain in place. You can continue to use that for students that you cannot pre-test. Also remember, remote CASAS and TABE testing is now allowable. We know there's some of you out there who are sort of trying to figure that out and make that happen and make that work, and we appreciate those of you who are working on that. We know it is a heavy lift. We encourage you to stay open and curious about it, and just know that that is possible and is allowable. And we also acknowledge that it is now allowed, if you decide to have hybrid in-person programming this summer, it is certainly possible that you could do in-person intake and NRS testing with some students. But if you choose to do that, please prioritize doing that because it gives you instructional information and helps you place a student into instruction rather than prioritizing it just for accountability purposes or reasons. In other words, don't open up your building just so you can test to get level gains or increase your post-testing rates. And also remember, and my last point here, remember, you have students in your communities for whom the recommendation is they should not report to your building, and you can and should continue to serve those students even if they cannot come and do an NRS test in person. All right, and then just one last slide to kind of wrap this up. We've been thinking about, in our team, and brainstorming about what do we think summer hybrid programming may look like in our ABE providers across the state. And we have a couple of ideas. These are not the only ideas, but a couple of general ideas. The first one is we think in some cases, some students might now be reporting to your buildings in addition to doing distance education. Other students may continue as distance only. For example, one way you might decide that is if you have students who have had barriers or difficulties with participating in distance education over the last few months, you may now adjust so that those students can receive some instruction in person. Ideally, in this scenario, part of what that in-person time does is helps them build their capacity to continue participating in distance education. So that's sort of one model. Another model you might choose is that you really continue to focus for all students that they spend the bulk of their time on distance education. However, you may choose to have some students physically report to the building for activities that support their capacity to participate in distance ed. So that could be if you are working with packets and paper instruction, that you now set up schedules for students to come, turn things in, pick up more work. Perhaps they have the opportunity to get some feedback or guidance from a teacher or a tutor when they do that. Another scenario for that is that you may now be able to offer some in-person support with devices or online learning programs that was difficult to do at a distance. So those are our initial thoughts from our team about what summer programming will look like. I think there's a lot going on in the chat. So I think at this point, we want to pause and open it up for some questions.
Yes, and I've asked Astrid to help us out with some of the questions because it has been a rich text discussion in the chat.
Yes, it has. So I think we've answered most of the questions in the chat, but let's just review to make sure that everybody was following those discussions. So first we had some questions about the difference between the use of school facilities for GED testing guidance versus the summer programming guidance, and if the summer programming guidance would override that use of school facilities for GED testing guidance. And as Todd clarified in the chat, those are two separate pieces of guidance, as GED testing is not part of the ABE system per se. Brad, I don't know if you want to expand at all on that.
No, in fact, in the guidance from the Department of Education, it asks that programs continue to use the MDH guidance that they were given before when we had the discussion, and that is the MDH guidance from April 29th.
Yeah, great. And then also some questions about what all of this means for corrections programming. And if, as we've stated before, there might be some different considerations or guidelines for corrections programs. And as Brad answered in the chat, programs, ABE programs operating in corrections would still need to follow all of the MDH guidelines, but we recognize that they also may be operating with different considerations in terms of the degree of in-person programming that they may be hosting at their sites. Caroline is raising the issue of this being sort of a challenging message to put out to learners without making assumptions about whether they are all at risk or discriminating against them. She says all of her learners are having a hard time right now with distance learning and could benefit from a hybrid model.
Astrid, I think
No, go ahead, Todd.
Yeah, so, I think that we're certainly not asking or suggesting that you would be making decisions about individual folks, individual students, but rather that you're looking at the structure of your programming through an equity lens and thinking about, for example, we have pretty consistently heard from folks around the state that it has been easier to reach students via distance learning who have higher literacy levels. And so that suggests to us that it may be that students with higher literacy levels have had more access to service, and that when we think structurally about what changes we would make to programming, we'd be mindful of that and thinking that students with lower levels of literacy, perhaps as identified by the courses that they place into, that you might think about structural programming, the structure of your programming around serving those students.
Thanks, Todd. We also have a question, follow-up question about access to technology to participate in remote testing. Kelly's asking, why can't students come to campus just to test? And so just to clarify, we want to make sure that people aren't making that decision simply for accountability or level gain purposes. If you have other reasons that you need test information about your students in order to place them into appropriate programming or make instructional decisions, that would be a good reason to have them come in to test. But if it's simply for level gain purposes, we would discourage you from doing so. A question from C, can our program be held liable if someone were to contract the coronavirus and blame us? Should we be having students or even staff sign a release form if they were to attend classes in person?
Astrid, can I take that one?
Yes,
C,
please,
that is a great question, and one that I'm afraid we are not in a position to give you guidance about. Typically, that's the kind of an issue that a school district would seek guidance from their own legal counsel on. And so I guess that would be my best suggestion, would maybe be to explore the support from your district. I'd like to just add one more thing also generally to this conversation about thinking about in-person programming. And I think part of what, is guiding thinking around the hybrid model, the decision the commissioner and the governor made, is that, Minnesota, there were huge concerns. The commissioner has expressed huge concerns around issues of equitable access to K-12 programming, and felt a real need to provide some option for addressing that equity issue. At the same time, I know that state officials are cautious about moving towards reopening because Minnesota hasn't even met the standards the feds set for reopening. Last Thursday, when Jan Malcolm, Commissioner of Department of Health, did her radio call-in show, one of the things she noted was that the guideline that they'd like to be below level of community spread is 30%, and Minnesota is over that. And the fear is that if a population has a community spread rate above 30%, that it makes the community vulnerable to spikes in disease outbreak. And then the second thing is the federal guidance suggested that there should be a decline in cases extending over a 14-day period before there is extensive reopening. And that has not happened in Minnesota. So I guess I would just caution all of you, if you think, for us, I'm thinking way back to that first update that we did, and thinking that one of our goals also has to be as a system, to be as good a partner as we can be in maintaining community health and community safety. And so we've been given some flexibility to increase equity as a primary goal established by the commissioner, and there are certainly other considerations as well. But I just would encourage everybody to use that flexibility judiciously and effectively.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
My soapbox now.
Thank you. We also had a question regarding additional guidance for counting hours for phone calls and paper-based packets. So just to clarify, instruction being conducted via phone or any other synchronous method can be counted for contact hours. And the distance learning team is looking at some processes that we might put in place for a teacher verification method that could be used to count hours for paper-based packets. So that's something currently under consideration. We have a question looking for some additional guidance confirmation about the impact of the 3% increase along with the 11% cap. So Todd or Brad, can you review again what you put in the chat explaining that?
Yeah, absolutely. Todd, I'll kick off and then I encourage you to jump on. So we want to make sure that the a couple people are asking about the 11% growth cap that one consortium can receive from, and that's the percentage. 11% is the maximum in terms of the contact hour portion of state ABE funding that your consortium can receive from one year to the next. When the statewide pot grows by 3%, that just means the pie got 3% bigger for the entire state. But the pieces are going to be divided out by each grantee and among each part of the funding formula. And so the 3% doesn't automatically mean that you only get an 8% growth if you are a large growing program or consortium. But it could, because there are a lot of unknown factors here. We don't know the statewide number of contact hours yet. We also don't know, because of that, what the contact hour rate is going to be. So, and the entire intent of the contact hour formula and that 11% growth cap is to ensure that, let's say one of our largest consortia grew by 40% in a year in terms of contact hours, and the contact hour rate remained relatively the same. To all of a sudden shift 40% of the contact hour portion of the funding, which is about half of our state ABE funding, or a little over half, that would mean that statewide a lot more resources are going to one consortium instead of the statewide pool, and that would destabilize our state funding across the board. And that's why that 11% is there. And that gets really detailed to talk through, and I would encourage folks to talk with us one-on-one, because I think trying to talk through it too much here might delay us from discussing summer AD programming too. So I encourage you to reach out to us individually. Todd, what would you add to it?
Oh, that sounds good, Brad. Thank you.
What additional questions?
Go ahead, Brad.
I was just going to ask you, what additional questions do we have?
Yes, and I may need a little assistance monitoring. We've got lots of questions coming in. So another question, what about counting online or on the phone enrollments? Can we count that time? So if, Anessia, to clarify, if you're asking about counting the time you're spending on intake, yes, you can count that time.
Yep, if you're doing phone-based intakes, that time is definitely countable as contact hours at a distance.
Then we also had a question from Brian about whether anyone knows of a general statement of a legal release of liability that might be used. So if anyone on our team does and wants to chime in, otherwise I'd encourage people to chime in the chat. Then we have a question about childcare support for ABE teachers. Low-level students in my class would be good candidates for this blended learning style, but I am unavailable for in-person teaching as I'm home with a young child while the daycare center remains closed. So I think a concern for many of us working in the ABE field. If anyone is aware of resources, if they would like to chime in here. Abby raises an important point here. Even if it's not a legal issue, I do think many of our students are taking whether we are open as a sign as to whether it is safe based on their trust in us and their respect for our authority. Even if not a legal issue, it's valuable to think about what message will be sent to students and volunteers about making their own decisions about what is safe for them. Excellent point, Abby.
So I think one of our next questions then is kind of a question for the group, which is from Kirsten, if a classroom is located inside another facility, such as a college or career force center where you pay rent, are the ABE program staff required to follow the directive on the site, basically by that host agency, or our directive? I just wonder how to handle those discussions and any thoughts or guidance. So, Jody, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so obviously that is a nuanced situation and a situation that I'm sure many of you are in. You have other partner organizations and entities, for many of you, in addition to school districts that you have to work with. So I believe, and I'm open to my team members or anybody adding to this, but I think this is a both and sort of a scenario where yes, you need to take into account this guidance that's coming from the governor, from the Department of Education, from the Department of Health, and from our office. And in addition, you definitely need to work with those partner entities, and hopefully, though that guidance wouldn't be in direct conflict with any decisions that would be made. But yeah, I believe you will have to have those conversations with partner entities. And yes, of course, you do need to, follow any guidance and guidelines and requirements of the entities who, physically own and run the spaces that your ABE programming uses.
Yeah, this is Julie. I would agree with that. I would always start with MDH guidance, then go with your organizations, and then look at what Minnesota State is asking. I think in a lot of cases, it can be worked out. Yeah.
Yeah, this is Todd. I just want to add on to, I agree with Jody and Julie. And I want to sort of actually also kind of address Carolyn's question about use of ABE funds for cleaning materials, things like that. And what I guess I want to maybe encourage people to think about is that really the guidance that you're getting from us is about allowable use of the state and federal ABE funds. And so when you think about things like, okay, the commissioner has provided provided permission for the adult basic ed system, and by that she really means programming paid for by ABE funding to be used to provide hybrid programming. That is not a directive about the programming, it's a directive about allowable use of the funding. And so that hierarchy that Julie just shared of think of the Department of Health guidelines, think about the entity that's legally responsible for the space in which you're holding programming, i.e. a college or a workforce center or a community-based organization. And then at that point, then what kicks in would be then, given those things, what are the allowable uses for ABE funding? And right now that's for distance learning or hybrid programming. And Carolyn, specifically to answer your question, we have a long history in ABE in Minnesota of trusting local programs to make decisions about what kinds of expenditures are needed to make programming possible, and pretty much allowing any expenditure needed in order to make programming possible. Having said that, just a quick note about cleaning supplies, masks, things like that. If those are available from other sources, that would be great. And ABE funds can only be used to purchase those kind of materials to be used in direct relationship with the ABE program. So for example, ABE cannot like buy all the masks for a whole school district, for example. It would have to be restricted just for purposes of making it possible to have ABE programming.
Thanks for that clarification, Todd. We have an update from Minneapolis that they'll be remaining online only for the month of June and July, but opening their testing center next week with the guidelines in place. Some reflection from Amy about the fact that there's another level of equity concern if the same people who are being left out, left behind, are also the ones facing greater exposure and health risks if they come in.
Yes.
Excellent point. Yeah, just taking elevators and going in and out of buildings is a concern and risk many people are trying to avoid. An attempt to have quality audio translated messaging for choosing not to risk exposure and naming the known categories that put more people at risk will be important to offer students. That's a great point, Amy. Thank you.
Astrid, with that point, I know there's more in the chat, but I'm worried that if we continue to do questions, we won't have time for the rest of our slides and the other content that we have today. So I'm wondering if you want to put questions on hold, or the next questions and comments on hold, and continue with some of our other content and then come back to this.
That sounds good. We'll circle back at the end of the webinar.
Excellent. Thank you, Astrid. Well, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Susan Wetkamp-Brandt, our Literacy Action Network president, to share some updates. Susan.
Okay, thanks. You can go on to the next slide, and I will try to be as quick as possible so that we can get back to some more of those questions. Some of these things have already been mentioned by Todd, but I do want to reiterate that we do have this contact our counting period working group, and that is open right now to take applications. We have already received a significant number of applications, more than we can accept, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't apply, because we do want to, as Todd said, be as representative as we possibly can of all the different kinds of ABE programming and different parts of the state and different roles. So put your application in and we will review it. Go ahead to the next slide, please. And Todd kind of stole my thunder here on this slide, but yes, we did have a big win for Minnesota ABE. So this was the bill gave us the full forecasted amount of funding. So ABE is always eligible to receive up to 3% funding if ABE were to grow significantly over the 10-year period, but that hasn't been the case recently, so we haven't been receiving it. But this year, the bill that went through the House and the Senate and has passed both of those chambers does give us the full forecasted amount of funding, which is 3% increase. So that becomes the new baseline for future years. And as Todd clarifies, that just increases the whole pool of available funding for ABE programs. So that would be distributed out to programs using the same formula that is always used, contact hours, base funding, etc. So thank you, I should say, to everybody who contacted one of their legislators to support ABE funding. That really does make a difference in us being able to get these bills through the House and the Senate. So thank you if you contacted a legislator. I'm sure it made a difference. Go ahead to the next slide. Summer Institute. We are going to offer Summer Institute as a virtual conference, and we need you. Right now, we don't have very many presentation proposals in, and we obviously can't have a conference if we don't have presenters. So we need you to put in a proposal for a virtual session. I want to reassure everyone that we will have tech coaches to help you through the technology. We'll have the opportunity for you to practice your session, to get some ideas for how to put together a webinar session. They will all be 45 minutes long, which is a nice, tight, and easy to implement kind of model for online. We're also going to have the option for poster sessions, and those will be done as recorded videos, 5 minutes long, that you can then post online and people can view and comment on. So please do put in your presentation proposals. We want to hear what innovative and interesting things all of you are doing across the state of Minnesota. All right, go on to the next slide, please. Distance learning updates. I'm also wearing that hat today because my colleague Tom, who often comments on these webinars, is off doing a North Star training today, so he can't be here. So now on to distance learning updates. We have developed a process for approving online courses that have been created by teachers, and 3 courses have already been approved through that process. You can see what they are here. And we have some other applications that have come in that we are reviewing. So if you have a course that's online on a website or a learning management system, so for example, maybe an adult diploma course, maybe it's part of a career pathway, a CNA course or something like that, that you've developed and are delivering to students, please put in an application to get that approved so that you can count proxy hours for the online learning that your students are doing. Go on to the next slide. And then we've also approved a number of platforms that can be used for distance learning proxy hours, including GED ready tests. So if you are remote proctoring a GED ready test where you're actually observing the student, you could take contact hours for that time. But if you're not proctoring and the student is working independently, you can count proxy hours for that time. That's now available to you. We have EBSCO Learning, which is part of the library's ELM system, and that has instruction on basic computer and digital literacy skills. So that's been approved. ReadWorks has been approved, and I do want to highlight that this platform, ReadWorks, has both paper and online versions approved. So it's the same content, just 2 different ways of delivering it. I do think that the online version has many advantages over the paper-based version. It's much more efficient for teachers to deliver. It has audio support for learners, which is a huge benefit. But if your students don't have a device or don't have internet access and you need an option for some kind of reading instruction via paper, ReadWorks might be an option that you want to look at. And then Goji Up Reader is another platform that's been approved, and it's a free app for both iOS and Android, and it allows teachers to actually put their own texts into the system and then develop instructional materials around that, or you can also use it to deliver their existing texts. So one of the advantages of this is that you could integrate it into an existing curriculum and upload your own materials or materials specific to a workplace if you're doing a workplace literacy type program. So it's a pretty flexible platform. So that's the list of newly approved platforms, and all of those are available on the distance learning website and have contacts for super users who can answer your questions about them. And go ahead, I think that's our last slide. But if not, let's see. Yep, that's it. We're going to turn it back over to Brad, and I'm happy to take any questions that folks have in the text chat, or you can drop us a line at the support desk and we'll answer your questions there.
Thank you so much, Susan, for both your Literacy Action Network update and for the distance learning update. Okay, so a couple things that we want to share today about high school equivalency, just very briefly. One of our latest statements was about access to school buildings for GED testing. We did send this out last week or 2 weeks ago at this point. And it's important to know with the statement that we made with allowing GED testing in public school buildings, it's important to know that it's permissive, meaning that it permits but does not require GED test centers in public school buildings to reopen. It also requires that programs follow the Minnesota Department of Health guidance on school building use guidance for in-person assessment / hands-on course completion, which is different than the summer programming Minnesota Department of Health guidance released. We also want to remind you that that guidance for GED testing applies only to GED testing centers located in public schools, Other facilities like colleges and jails and prisons are operating potentially under different guidelines, and that is, and we know some in those other facilities or types of facilities have reopened as well, and some of them have stayed closed. And we also want to remind folks that GED Testing Service and Pearson VUE have also released their own requirements and guidance, and this guidance that we released does not override that guidance that they sent to you, but they can actually dovetail and work together. One other new development is that is with OP, and this is online proctored of GED testing, meaning a student could take the GED test at home if their computer meets the technical requirements. This will be available in Minnesota as early as next week. The cost for this type of test is the same as on-site GED testing. The proctors are not from our local testing centers, though. They're from OnView, which is a remote testing company subsidiary of Pearson VUE. If for anyone that's interested, we will have a GED virtual meeting to discuss OP and other new developments. This is open to anyone working with GED students. You could be a GED prep teacher, you could be a GED testing center proctor, or you could be an ABE administrator or support staff. Any of you are welcome to this webinar on next week, Thursday, from 11:30 to 1. You can see the link to register here. That link is also available if you download the slides in the materials. And for anyone that's attended previous sessions, I did send out an email just before this webinar about this meeting. In terms of our participation, this is the way that students will be invited to participate in OP. Anyone, the first round, as early as next week, will be GED Testing Service will automatically invite any of those with a canceled test since mid-March. And they will be invited to participate. After those testers have been invited, then they will invite testers who have passed 3 of the 4 tests. Then they will invite those that are on our state priority tester list. And this is a list. You can send me names of any individual that you think should be on this priority tester list, and that could be anyone with a job offer, those enlisting in the military, those that are court ordered to test, and any other priority that you might see. Please send us those names, the GED ID number, and the reason for prioritization, and I'll be sending that list to GED Testing Service next week. They will invite, then after that, all individuals who have a GED Ready Green within the last 60 days. Note for OP testing, unlike in-person testing, OP testing at this point will require that a student or a tester have a GED Ready Green score, which is a likely to pass score within the past 60 days in that subject in order to be able to schedule. Also, with the GED subsidy code, we still have not received the April invoice. We're going to receive it yet this afternoon. But at this point, we know that about 90% of the subsidy has been spent and that there's only about $28,000 left of that subsidy. We anticipate that that subsidy will likely run out before June 30th, but again, the same amount will be available starting July of 2020. And for anyone that wants to take the GED Ready, they are going, GED Testing Service is doing a GED Ready promotion. Anyone with a canceled test since mid-March will receive a free GED Ready voucher, and they'll actually receive an invite to take the GED OP version of the test, or online proctored or OnView proctored test, as if they're willing to go submit a survey after the testing process. Any others will get an invitation. Anyone else can get an invitation to get GED Ready for 50% off. And this promotion will be introduced and discussed later this month. I have not yet heard if schools or AD programs can buy that GED Ready voucher. If you want to buy your own vouchers for your students, I assume that you can probably take that 50 or buy them at the 50% off, but that is just my guess. GED Testing Service hasn't confirmed that yet. And I also just wanted to remind folks that the High Seas competition is underway. We have the final materials drafted for the Minnesota High School Equivalency Assessments, and that will be posted in June for any test vendor to reply. We have almost all of our reviewers selected, and we're still just looking for a representative from our tribal nations. If any representatives from our tribal nations or those that serve tribal nations would like to be considered, please let me know. But that's the only reviewer position that we're still looking for. It is anticipated that our results will be announced in July sometime, and that our likely transition period will start in July if there are any new tests that are approved, and end as early as December, but likely that could be extended as well. That's everything for high school equivalency assessments and GED testing. I'm going to take questions in the chat, but at this point, Julie, I'm going to turn it over to you for transitions updates.
Thank you, Brad. And currently there are only 3 quick updates around transitions. One of them, Todd already mentioned about integrated education and training. Just a reminder that the approval form is due June 12th. And this should be, there's a portion that needs to be completed by the instructors who actually teach the class. And it requires a single set of shared learning outcomes. And this is the area that a lot of people have had questions about, like how do you write a single set of shared learning outcomes? I want to make people aware there is a webinar that's going to talk about this, that'll provide an overview of how to do this, and it should help instructors just get a basic of understanding of where to start and to get some a rough draft down just to start with. Next, please. The regional transitions plans will be submitted in mid-June. And I want to let people know that the focus will be, or the priority is going to be on integrated education and training. We really want to let people let them know that delivering IET courses through distance education, training teachers on online instruction, and collaborating regionally to develop resources and offer programming are all acceptable uses of using the transitions funding. So make sure you connect with the regional transitions coordinator in your area. If you have ideas on how you think the funding should be spent, or if you have some projects you think that could be promoted regionally, please get in contact with them. Next slide, please. And finally, the Integrated English Literacy and Civics Education Grants. Originally, I was thinking of trying to set up virtual monitoring visits, and I think we're moving to just check-in calls. Monitoring visits are going to be too difficult to try to do virtually. So what you will be receiving shortly within this week probably is an invitation to set up a check-in call with me and possibly some other state staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. And now I'm going to turn it over to Astrid Leiden about resources and professional development.
Thanks, Brad. So just a few quick reminders for people about the many resources and training opportunities that our support network has available for you as you navigate these times. One more time, just a reminder that our COVID-19 and distance education resource hub on Schoology is a place for you to go to share ideas, ask questions, access resources in a number of different areas as you're thinking about how you're going to approach summer programming for your program. That would be a great place to go to share your thoughts and connect with other program managers and instructors to think about what might work. So encourage you to join that and visit it regularly if you haven't done so already. Then just looking ahead, we also have a variety of distance learning resources available to you. So a reminder about our MNABE distance learning website, where you can find information about all of the approved platforms, where you can find the approval form for teacher created distance learning courses and other resources around distance learning. There have also been some national responses to supporting the adult education field around the quick transition to distance education. So the National EdTech Center out of World Education has set up a distance learning website with lots of suggestions for getting up and running quickly. And they also have weekly webinars that they're archiving on distance education strategies. So some really great practical suggestions that are being shared by programs all around the country. And then finally, if you'd like to network with others around the country around integrating technology, you can join the Links community to discuss those issues. Let's go to the next slide, Brad. So we've had a whirlwind of virtual coffee breaks over the past couple of months. These have been opportunities for practitioners to come together around particular content or contexts to share resources, ideas, suggestions, challenges. They've been very well attended with some really robust conversations. So if you have not been able to participate, detailed notes from those coffee breaks are archived in the COVID-19 Schoology group. I'd encourage you to check those out. And we have one more on the schedule for this spring that our colleagues at Panda will be hosting around mental wellness. That'll be next week, May 27th. We don't yet have any more scheduled for summer, but I anticipate some more will come on the calendar soon. And then we also have a number of webinars coming up. If you'll go to the next slide, Brad. Just want to highlight one coming up tomorrow around distance learning platforms. So as Susan mentioned, we've had a number of new platforms approved recently. Things have been moving very quickly. So to get an update on what's new and approved for Minnesota, you can check out that webinar. Julie mentioned the webinar we're having next week around designing a single set of learning objectives for IET. We have an excellent presenter, Amy Dulcimer, coming to present with us, formerly from LaGuardia Community College, now with ARR. So a really practical, interactive webinar she has planned for us. And then a number of webinars coming up from our colleagues at Literacy Minnesota, virtual pronunciation instruction, virtual instruction for low-level ESL. I know that's been one of the student groups that has been most challenging to reach for our program. So can look forward to some suggestions on that webinar. And then I don't know if any of you were able to participate in the Using Volunteers webinar earlier this morning, but there are a number of programs that are using volunteers very effectively to support their learners during this time. So Literacy Minnesota is going to be hosting a number of webinars for volunteers to get them up and running with remote tutoring. So would encourage you to think about sending your volunteers to one of those webinars to get some guidance on how to do that best. Let's move to the next slide. A reminder that all of our webinars that have been recorded are archived on our Minnesota ABE PD YouTube channel, so you can check those out if you've missed them. We'll go to the next slide. Want to remind everybody in the midst of the craziness that this spring has been, just looking ahead to next year, we do plan on running our CCRS implementation cohort starting in the fall. We're not sure yet whether that will be in-person, distance, or a hybrid format. Still grappling with that decision, but we will definitely be moving forward with that. As a reminder, we do expect that all consortia have a team participate in this cohort at some point. And all programs that are operating standard adult diploma programming need to go through the CCRS cohort prior to launching their programming. This is a team-based professional development experience, so ideally you will send a team that would have at least one administrator, one ELA teacher, and one math teacher. And for our smaller programs out there, we can certainly be flexible with this, or you might want to think about participating with others from your region and have a regional team approach. Those applications are available on the Atlas website. They're due June 1st. If you have any questions about what that involves or you're considering participation, feel free to contact me, or you can contact Christine Kelly at Atlas. She's the CCRS lead. And then finally, just a reminder again that all of the rapidly changing PD information and additions are coming to your inbox every Tuesday in the Minnesota ABE Connect newsletter. So that's where you can find an updated list of what PD has been scheduled. And there have just been an excellent series of newsletter articles coming out with really practical information about distance education, insight into how programs around the state are finding ways to effectively connect with your students. So encourage you to take the time to check that out every Tuesday. And at this point, I think we'll move into some additional questions, Brad.
Yes, thank you, Astrid. So at this point, please continue to chat in your questions, or you can click to drag or click to on your hand to raise your hand, and you could ask questions or share some ideas or thoughts that you have about what your program might be doing going into this summer. I know the conversation has been rich in our chat as well, and so that is outstanding that you're collaborating and sharing with one another on this. Jody or anyone from our team, anything standing out in the chat right now?
I do see some questions regarding the training and onboarding of new volunteers. That's certainly something that the training team at Literacy Minnesota is working on. And I know there is a goal to have something in place by the fall so that new volunteers could participate in training in an online format so that the programs could bring on new volunteers.
Excellent. So Kirsten is sharing that she's having some serious concerns about continuing to do things as they are being done right now. That currently many teachers are meeting one-on-one virtually with students, and she's saying that's really expensive and it's hard to make that financially sustainable to pay teachers to instruct one-on-one. And she's concerned this will have a huge impact on the contact hours over the summer, and that they will expend a lot of money and generate few contact hours, which could then create issues down the road, like in 2021 and 2022. She had thought about only allowing summer online programming that is set up to meet with a cohort of students rather than focusing on one-on-one tutoring. And she was curious what other managers and administrators are thinking about that with that programming model.
And as people are chiming in, just to add some further clarification around the 12-hour training, we have another question about that in the chat. So to clarify, for your current volunteers who were working with students prior to school closures, under the guidance of a teacher, those volunteers are currently exempt from the 12-hour training requirement as they continue working with students. Any new volunteers coming in would need to complete the 12-hour training prior to working with students and generating contact hours.
So this is Jody, and I'd like to speak to your concern, Kristen. Can I go ahead?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, heard some noise. So in terms of the future funding and how contact hours that are currently being recorded will affect future funding, absolutely, that is a good and important question to be asking at this time. I would encourage you and anyone who's making budget decisions about future ABE funding to remember that the working group that will be convened by our MDE team in partnership with Literacy Action Network is going to be addressing that issue of how should we, what decision should we make about what contact hours will quote unquote count for figuring out funding for the following fiscal year. So I would encourage you, any of you who are making budget decisions, to wait to make any programmatic decisions about, not allowing certain kinds of programming because of contact hours that it does or doesn't generate, I would encourage you to wait to make that decision until that working group has had a chance to really work through those issues, and until we have a decision, a recommendation, and then a decision about what hours we will use in calculating the formula for fiscal year 21-22 funding. Does that make sense? Anybody else on the MDE team want to add to that? Or the LAN team?
Just, Jody, maybe the one thing that I would add to that, I agree with everything that you said, is just to remind folks that when you, so the first question is what happens to the overall appropriation? And looks like, that's going to go up 3% for this year, and that will become the new baseline. So we'll preserve that going forward. So the second thing I just want to remind everybody is that the various counts that are used in the formula, whether it's the community ed census count or the second prior year LEP count from the member districts or the census no diploma count or contact hours, that those are used to divvy up chunks of the state allocation in a pro rata fashion. And so if you have, if you have 10% of the LEP student count in the state, basically you get 10% of the money that's assigned to that count. And so I guess what I'm trying to encourage people to think about is that sort of everybody is likely to be experiencing the same attenuation in terms of programming that generates contact hours. But, contact hours could drop substantially, and as long as everyone's proportionate share of contact hours stays the same, everybody would get the same proportionate share of the state allocated amount of money. I know that doesn't answer all questions, but it's I think something that's good to be mindful of, and certainly we will see to it that that is something that folks on the working group understand and take into consideration how the various constraints on programming have affected different kinds of consortia with different client profiles in different parts of the state.
Todd, do you want to mention anything about the existing disruption item in the statute as well, in case there is a situation where a contact hour sort of distribution across programs does shift significantly?
Yeah, Susan, thank you for bringing that up. That's a great point, that we do have language in statute that does provide a safety net of sorts for programs that see large declines in numbers caused by disruptions, like as an example of which, a good example of which perhaps is the current disruption under COVID. And so that is also there as a sort of a hold harmless protection for programs. So yeah, thanks, Susan. Thanks for reminding me of that.
And I do think that although the working group itself will make the determination of exactly how they want to incorporate feedback from the broader ABE community, I think it is likely that there will be some mechanism for other managers who aren't actively serving on the working group to share their perspectives with those who are. So we do obviously want to be able to hear from everyone about the realities that they're facing and be able to incorporate that into the planning process, which is one of the reasons why we're meeting several times across a period of time, so that we can actually hear from more people in more ways and get more input.
Perfect, Susan. Thank you for adding that.
And this is Jody again. I just want to add a final comment because I see there continues to be a little bit of discussion about this in the chat. I want you all to keep in mind that any factor that results in a statewide decline in hours relatively evenly does not result in a statewide reduction of funding, right? So that happened with the polar vortex. There was a lot of worry that winter about loss of hours and that would result in loss of funding for the following year, but for most consortia, it did not, because it affected us across the entire state. And we are again in that same scenario, even more pronounced probably, that across our state, one-on-one programming is far more common now than it was several months ago. So just keep in mind that statewide perspective when thinking about funding for the upcoming year. That the current statewide decline in hours does not automatically result in a decline in funding.
Okay, thank you, Jody, and thank you, Todd. I think at this point we can stop the recording of the video. I do want to acknowledge that